But in the 50s, in Cambridge, where I was, Skinner was just orthodoxy.
Okay, I'm still tempted to go back to Skinner a bit because, after all, I'm identified with him. I'm identified with him enough that I'm kind of curious about what some of the interactions were in his early days before I even came along to do work there in that department, and we discussed that a little bit last time. What is it about him? Do you think that these are the kinds of things that have led people to just sort of be the reaction to Skinner is often not a dispassionate one. It's often a fairly emotional one, and so, for example, I had this experience. Oh, sure.
Bicycle?
With Rosa. I'm going by car with Rosa.
You're going out?
To the market.
What?
Market. To the market.
To the market? Okay. Little side distraction, sorry.
That's okay. Well, so I'm just curious. Let me ask you this kind of question. We once at UMBC had a distinguished linguist visit. I won't name him. He's from had come from the West, traveling in this area, and he gave a colloquium. And among the things he was interested in was language change and pidgin languages and so forth and so on. And we went out to dinner together afterwards. And there were a bunch of faculty members, including me and another of my colleagues in my department, in the psychology department. And we were having a discussion, and we were talking about language evolution and many of the kinds of topics that you and I have been talking about. And at one point in the discussion, the other colleague from my department mentioned, oh, by the way, Charlie once worked with B.F. Skinner and was involved in his lab. And this linguist with whom I was having this ongoing, very interesting conversation looked at me and then stopped the conversation and didn't even make eye contact with me for the rest of that dinner. The mere mention of Skinner's name was enough to turn the conversation off. And I'm just wondering, could you say anything about Skinner's interactions with other people that might have led to this guy? It's a kind of thing, by the way, I've lived with throughout my career. I
knew about all of this in the 1950s and early 60s. After that, I don't have any experience with it. Skinner just kind of disappeared from the discussion. But in the 50s, in Cambridge, where I was, Skinner was just orthodoxy. Everybody worshipped at his feet. The William James lectures had appeared in 1948, 1949. They were circulated everywhere. It's what later came out as verbal behavior. And they were just dogma. That had answered all the questions about language, cognition, psychology, behavior. It was most extreme. If you take the case of the most influential intellectual figure in the Cambridge scene was W.V. Quine, brilliant philosopher, extreme Skinnerian. Take a look at his book, Word and Object, in 1960. Language is a complex of behaviors which are created by operant conditioning. That's it. That's orthodoxy. So it's not that there was any opposition to Skinner. In fact, he was practically God. There were a couple of us, 2 or 3 graduate students, who just didn't believe any of it. Eric Lenneberg was one, went on to found Biology of Language. Morris Halley was the other old friend. And when I was asked to write a review of the book, I thought this is a good chance to show that the dogmas, actually, I had Quine more in mind than I had Skinner when I wrote the book, to tell you the truth. I didn't think Skinner could even hear the objections. He was utterly self-confident, totally arrogant, couldn't hear anything, but I thought others might hear it. And I thought it was a good opportunity to bring into the discussion of these issues two things. First, the behaviorist approach, which was in its most influential form in Skinner, was simply a way of translating ordinary common sense mentalistic discourse into what looked like scientific discourse. So instead of saying John wants to read a book, you can say John is reinforced by reading a book. Okay. Across the board, that's what it is. I went into detail to try to show that if you take the terms in their technical meaning, everything that's said is false. If you take it in the loose meaning, in which it's a rephrasing of mentalistic vocabulary, it's just scientism, making things look as if they're saying something when you're just repeating normal informal discourse. The other thing I wanted to bring in is that there are other studies. There's other work in psychology, which was unknown, and I thought was much more important, like, say, Carl Ashley's serial order and behavior. Very important. Unknown in the psycho. Totally unknown. No references to it, except in neuroscience. European ethology, unknown. Tinbergen, Lawrence, and was known to comparative psychologists, but not to the people in unity of science, the modern, the Cambridge environment, totally unknown. There was, I think I mentioned some of George Miller's work, which did undermine a lot of the assumptions, but basically it was unknown. That was the situation then, and that was the reason for the review. I knew it would have no impact at all on psychologists because they can't hear it. I thought maybe others, younger people, would, and to an extent it did. But Skinner and I personally remained perfectly friendly. We understood each other perfectly. We understood that we cannot discuss these topics. They're fixed. He knew the answers. Doesn't matter what the facts are. So we talked about other things. In fact, I'll tell you one example, which may surprise you. I happened to be at Harvard in 1964, 1965. For the year, I was in a visitor at the Miller-Brunner Cognitive Science Center. So I was at Harvard. Now, you recall what was happening that year in the war in Vietnam, which I was very much involved in, was heating up. In February, McGeorge Bundy, who was the national security advisor, advised, and they implemented the first bombing of North Vietnam. Bundy was very directly implicated in that. Shortly after that, Bundy was invited to give the commencement address at Harvard in the June commencement. A couple of graduate students got together and decided to put together a very mild statement saying, we think it would be worth reconsidering whether it's proper to invite as the honored commencement speaker the person who has just initiated publicly the bombing of another country. That was the statement, basically. Well, since I was there, they asked me if I would try to circulate it among the faculty to see if there could be any signers. None. Nobody wanted to sign it. One exception, Skinner. I went to stop by his house, talked for a while, showed him this, asked if he'd want to sign it, said sure. He didn't care one way or another about the war in Vietnam. In fact, he was in favor of it, but he knew it would sort of irritate his colleagues, so he signed it. As soon as any serious involvement in protest against the war began, he was never part of it. He had no interest. But he was an independent-minded person. I liked that aspect of him. Didn't happen to like the background of it, but that was there.
Gracias por ver este vídeo, os dejamos por aquí un enlace a nuestra última formación y por aquí algunos vídeos que os pueden resultar de interés. Si estáis buscando ayuda psicológica, también podéis mirar en la descripción del vídeo, donde encontraréis nuestra web y podréis solicitar asistencia terapéutica de un profesional confiable y que os ofrecerá ayuda psicológica basada en evidencia científica.